Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Voice of San Diego podcast. I'm Sarah Libby, managing editor at Voice of San Diego. And if you haven't heard, we hosted our biggest event of the year, Politifest, on Saturday at the University of San Diego. It was a day filled with discussions about housing, transit, and homelessness. So shout out to everybody who attended and to everyone who helped put it together. And at the heart of many of these problems is the issue of supply. California doesn't have enough homes for everyone, and it isn't building enough homes either. Our friend Dillon, who covers housing for the Los Angeles Times, moderated a fascinating discussion about California's housing supply with a great group of experts, including State Senator Scott Weiner, the author of Senate Bill 50, which would allow for far more home building near transit. So here is that discussion. Enjoy.
So my name is Dillon. I'm a reporter at the Los Angeles Times, but it's wonderful to be back in San Diego. I worked for many years at Voice of San Diego, and it's just, I remember being at the first Politifest in 2011, and it's amazing to see how it's grown, and to see also so many people that I recognize and had such fond memories of. So this is going to be fun. So we'll start. I have covered housing issues for the LA Times for about 3.5 years. Worked predominantly out of Sacramento, just moved to Los Angeles to continue covering the issue more from a neighborhood perspective rather than a legislative one. But I know a lot about what's been going on at the Capitol and around the state on this issue, and I'm going to kind of start here with a primer before we bring up our guests on the state of housing supply, or maybe housing supply and its discontents when it comes to solving the housing crisis in the state. So let's start. So here's the problem, and folks who are buying or renting in California probably know this very well. For the price of one home in the state, you could buy the average home in the United States twice. These numbers, median home value is close to $600,000, which is nearly 2.5 times the national average, and median rental of $2,542 is $1,000 a month more than the national average. Some eagle-eyed folks might see that actually the bar graph doesn't quite line up with the numbers on the side there, but you know, I have a pretty small graphics budget, so here we are. Okay, so that seems like a problem, but what does this actually mean? Well, it means that California has the nation's highest poverty rate. And how can that be, right? We have huge wealth. Well, there are actually two measures of poverty that the U.S. Census uses, and the kind of better measure that actually takes into account people's experiences on the ground include cost of living. And by that metric, California does indeed have the highest poverty rate in the country. More than 1 in 6 residents are living in poverty. We also in the state now have the lowest homeownership rate since World War II. Nearly a quarter of the nation's homeless population, the last count had it at about 130,000 residents statewide, but you'll almost certainly see that number go up when the new figures come out at the end of the year, beginning of next. And just for context, California has 12% of the nation's population overall. 1.5 million California families pay more than half their income on rent. That's the definition of severely rent burdened, and so a huge number of residents are in that situation. And if people are spending so much of their money on housing, they're not spending it on other things. And as a result, we see, by a variety of estimates, at least $100 billion drag annually on the state's economy as a result of the housing problems we have. So it looks like it's getting worse. Here are some of the recent figures you see from areas around the state on homelessness. I mentioned, the overall 130,000 number, which is getting bigger. But San Francisco, their recent count, up 30%. We're close to 10,000 people there. Alameda County, where we're Oakland and other areas in the East Bay, up 43%. LA County, 12% to 59,000 people, which is, a mid-sized city in LA and San Diego and many other places around the state. So how did we get here? Yeah, this is the rent is too damn high guy, who deservedly is pretty famous these days. Hopefully we can get further if this clicker works. There we go. Okay, so one main issue, and this speaks to the heart of this panel, is California does not build housing like it used to. you'll see in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had a significant amount of new building in this state. And ever since that a bit of a boom in the early 2000s, even though we're in an economic expansion now, we're not seeing that same level of production. That black line there, how much we need to build to meet demand, that's the official estimate from the state housing department, says that simply to meet population growth, we need 180,000 units being built every year. As you can see, that number has not been reached since the looks like 2005. We also don't fund affordable housing in the state, the extent to which it's needed. There was a thought experiment done a few years ago by the Legislative Analyst Office, that's kind of a nonpartisan outfit in the state capitol, that says simply to fund new housing for the most sort of vulnerable renters, those who are low-income folks paying more than half of their income on rent, it would take a bond that to service that debt would cost between $15 billion and $30 billion every single year for the next 30 years. We currently spend a fraction of that amount. And again, that's just simply to build new housing for folks who are the most vulnerable. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind, I think, and generally speaking, when folks think about housing subsidy, they think about, say, Section 8, or they think about, funding for construction for low-income development. They don't actually realize or understand that in this country and in this state, we subsidize homeowners to a significant amount, 15 times more than we, at least in California, than we do renters, predominantly through things like the mortgage interest deduction. And so I think people need to keep that in mind when thinking about housing subsidy, is that actually homeowners get a lot more of it. And then while there is a shortage of homes overall in the state, as the last graph showed, there's a much bigger shortage of homes for those making low and middle income. So the governor, new governor came into office the beginning of last year, or this year rather. He's called for the building of 3.5 million homes between now and 2025. That means 500,000 new homes a year. And for some context, you can see the upper right-hand corner. That's kind of where Gavin is up there. That's absolutely to scale, so for those who are checking. Obviously this is a huge, promising a huge increase in housing production. He also called for a Marshall Plan for affordable housing. And so his promises to address the underlying housing supply issues in the state could not be more ambitious than what he's laid out. So what does the research say? Generally speaking, when you're talking about housing supply, there's a consensus among the academic experts that building more at an aggregate level, like a metropolitan region, so the whole San Diego region or the whole LA region or what have you, generally helps ameliorate housing cost pressures. And that's the same whether it's market rate housing or deed-restricted affordable housing. In general, at the aggregate level, what the research says is more building helps deal with cost pressures. However, there is less data and facts about what happens at a neighborhood level when it comes to housing costs. So if you center development only in a particular place, particular community, particular neighborhood, there's less consensus on what that might mean for housing costs in that area, and also for issues like gentrification and displacement. So how would the governor actually try to meet those big housing goals? Well, he's would have to take on some sacred cows or third rails in the state. And that will be the thing that we will be talking about with our great panelists. So first, here's where you can find me, my Twitter handle, email, and then I have a podcast I co-host with a colleague based in Sacramento called Gimme Shelter, which also has the benefit of being the best Rolling Stone song. And so you can check that out every other week. And even better, we're actually going to be doing a live version of the podcast later on today here. So with that, I'm going to bring up our four guests to talk about housing supply. We will start with Elise Lowe, who works for the city of San Diego. And now Ray Major from Sandag. Maya Rosas of the YIMBY Democrats of San Diego. And State Senator Scott Weiner from San Francisco. think you have to flip the mics on. So, Ray, my presentation was very much kind of state-specific, right? And I'm hoping that you could get a little bit into some more San Diego numbers in this regard. So could you explain some of the imbalance between job growth and housing growth in San Diego in recent years?
Sure. So when you take a look at the San Diego numbers or the graph that Liam put up, the San Diego graph looks pretty much the same. We haven't kept up with the amount of housing that we need to build since the bottom of the Great Recession. And so we're growing at about 27,000 jobs per year. We have about 30,000 people who are coming into the region or just have natural increase. We have more people here in the region. And we're building somewhere around 6,000 housing units, 7,000 housing units a year. So that's like one housing unit for every 4 to 5 people who come into the region. We are right now probably at a deficit of about 63,000 housing units just since this last economic cycle. When you do take a look at other things like Airbnbs, we've lost about 14,000 units just from people taking those housing units off the market and using them for short-term rentals. There's 14,000 there and another 27,000 second homes in the region that are basically people's second homes, so they're not really available to rent. So we're probably short about 100,000 units in the region right now.
Go to Senator Weiner. You're known for introducing a legislation that aims to increase housing production across the state. Could you explain what Senate Bill 50 would do?
There we go. Thank you for having me. Sure. So the goal of Senate Bill 50 is to help put us on the road to close California's 3.5 million home housing shortage, and to make sure that as we build the millions of homes that we need in California, that we are not doing sprawl. Because the last thing we need is to continue to do what we've been doing, which is, okay, we're not going to build enough housing, and the housing we do build, we'll just build it further and further and further out and cover up farmland and open space and clog the freeways and force people into multi-hour commutes and undermine our own carbon emission goals. And so we need to build that housing, and let's not build it far away. Let's not build it in wildfire zones. Let's build it in our infill, near public transportation, near jobs. So the bill will, and it's a very non-controversial, easy bill, it sets basic baseline standards for local zoning. We have traditionally in California allowed cities to do whatever zoning they want to do with some very weak state standards. And so what we've seen is upwards of as much as 75% of California is zoned for only single-family homes, meaning that all multi-unit is prohibited. And that's true in job centers, it's true by major public transportation. And so the bill will say if you're within a half a mile of fixed rail, quarter mile of high-frequency bus service, or in a job-rich area, a city cannot put a cap on density. You can't say only R1 or R2, and if it's within a half a mile of fixed rail, you can't push the height limit between 4 or 5 stories. This bill also allows statewide by right fourplex. So that you could turn a single-family home, if it's big enough, into a duplex or triplex or fourplex, not by tearing it down, but by doing an interior renovation. The bill also has strong tenant anti-demolition protections, because we don't want this to be a tool of sort of wiping away existing housing and pushing people out. And it has some inclusionary standards. It does preserve a lot of local decision-making around the approval process for individual projects, local design standards, for the most part, local height limits, local setbacks, local demolition restrictions, and so forth. So it's not eliminating local decision-making, contrary to what some of the opponents of the bill say, and it does not encourage demolition. What it does allow is to build more housing where it should be.
So how would your bill change San Diego?
San Diego has transit. And so in the areas around the light rail, around the train stations, it would be zoned for more density within a half a mile. For the high-frequency bus stops and high-frequency bus service, it's a pretty high standard. It has to be 12-minute headways during rush hour, and then has to have consistent service from early morning into the evening and service 7 days a week. So this isn't about those buses that are coming, once an hour or only during rush hour. Has to be real, 7 day a week good bus service. The density would be relaxed. I think about 60% of San Diego is zoned for single family or thereabouts. That's what I've been told. They're nodding, so maybe I'm right. And so not in all of those areas, but in parts of those single family areas, small to mid-size multi-unit would be allowed. It would largely be subject to whatever the local height limit is. So if the local height limit is 30 feet, you could do a 3-story building. And then, as with the rest of the state, people would be able to turn buildings into duplex, triplex, fourplex. If it's a vacant lot, you could build a fourplex. I should say that because we have now finally, hopefully, made clear what we've been trying to make clear for 37 years, that cities must allow ADUs. That was the law passed in the early 80s, and cities, including my own city of San Francisco, ignored it for decades. We've now made crystal clear and closed a lot of the loopholes, mandating that cities allow both an ADU and a junior ADU. So we already have a form of statewide triplex in California, although it's limited because there are limitations on ADUs. So the statewide fourplex in SB 50 is still very impactful, but it's not as impactful as before because we've already gone part of the way there.
Elise, Mayor Faulkner made a big deal about calling himself a YIMBY. He's put forward a number of things at the beginning of the year that aim to increase housing supply, especially near transit. How's that going?
It's actually going really well. There's going to be an environmental document released soon so that the city can put forward to the city council for approval, essentially in exchange for affordable housing on site in transit areas, unlimited density, so unlimited height. That would be a huge game changer. It would actually go a little bit further than what you're describing in SB 50 for those specific areas, but it also would require community benefits in exchange for this. So it's really trying to look at all of the different needs of the community and not just height, but how do we provide additional community benefits in exchange for that. So I think that that's going to be quite a game changer. There's also been proposals put forward for different income levels of housing, so a moderate housing density bonus, which I know a number of developers are looking forward to having that come forward. They want to build at different income levels. They might not be able to have the financing to build at a very low or low, but looking at that moderate level, that missing middle where we haven't seen a lot of that development. So there's a number of proposals that reflect our development impact fees, changes to that methodology, which will make it so that we can incentivize smaller units and more of them. Essentially right now, a developer, when they come in to pay an impact fee, they pay on a unit, no matter the unit size. Well, if you have to pay more for a higher unit size, that's going to incentivize the smaller units. So that's another proposal that the city's working on. And we've worked really hard within the city, not only at the policy level, but within my department, the development services department that does all the permitting, to change our policies and process so that we can reduce the amount of time that it takes too. Because we know that time is money, and we don't want the money and the expenses incurred by developers passed on to the folks that are buying the units. So I'm doing everything I can to try to revolutionize the process.
To my knowledge, the mayor here has not proposed any changes to single-family areas. Why not?
That's right. So the type of unlimited height he does not feel would be appropriate in a single-family neighborhood, but he's been very supportive of the ADU, and we've even put forward waivers, fee waivers, and financial incentives. So with the community plan updates that the city has undergone over the last couple of years, we have actually greatly densified many neighborhoods. There is still single-family residential in some of them, but for the most part, we've added by right 60,000 units in San Diego, and by the time we're done updating community plans, it'll be 100,000 units. And then with density bonus, that's going to get San Diego to an additional by right 200,000 units of housing supply in existing neighborhoods.
So I just want to push on this a little bit and open it up for everyone. Is someone, what to everyone's mind and the panel is the best defense of single-family only zoning, and what is the best argument against it?
I'll just say one thing before I let everyone else talk, sorry. Community character, so that's something that we ought to just have a panel about and talk about. Having that be a part of environmental analysis and CEQA and community character, we are essentially allowing that, we can't change the neighborhood at all because of community character, and that's worth debate, right? Because for years, that level of let's have community character be every house should look the same, and that's what's growing and evolving, and I think that that's presenting obstacles and challenges to the development that we so greatly need.
If you take a look at the San Diego region, and most of it right now is single-family housing, and if you look at that as the urban footprint, we need to add another 700,000 people by 2050. That's what our population growth is going to be, and with that, maybe another 400,000 housing units in the same urban footprint. So we really need to absolutely rethink what housing looks like in the region, and we really need to, if you want to meet the greenhouse gas goals and also the VMT goals, we're going to have to fundamentally take a look at how we can build housing around transit and densify, but we need to do it from a regional perspective, because there's no way that you can cram that many more people into the region without having high-density housing around transit. So.
I'll add to the pile-on against single-family housing. There is really no excuse for single-family housing to be zoned within transit priority areas, within the areas that Senator Weiner is talking about. There is just no excuse for our communities to be built to exclude so many people to be living near our public infrastructure, our transit network. And so I think that should be a really big priority for everyone, is to make sure that we allow for more people to live near transit so that they can have access to get around, to get to their job, to get to school, and without a car. It's so needed.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to defend single-family mandates. So I think when you say single-family zoning, people sometimes think that it means it's okay to build single-family there, but it's important for people to understand that single-family zoning is a mandate to only build single-family homes, and it's a ban on apartment buildings, and it's effectively a ban on affordable subsidized housing for low-income people, because with very rare exceptions, no one's building affordable subsidized single-family homes. It has to be multi-unit to pencil out. And this isn't about whether we like or don't like single-family homes. I grew up in a single-family home. It was great. There's a lot of people want to live in single-family homes, and that's great. But the reality is two things. Increasingly, maybe a lot of people look at polling like so many people want to live in single-family. For a large majority of San Diegans, and increasingly California as a whole, people can't afford to live in a single-family home, and so it is incredibly exclusionary. It means you have to only be above a certain income to be able to live in this community. It creates a huge math problem, because if you're going to say, particularly in our urban areas where the jobs are, where the transit is, every parcel is only allowed to have one unit plus, say, an ADU, that creates an inherent math problem in terms of filling our housing deficit. And when we allow it near the jobs and transit, all we're doing is inducing sprawl. So it's not about getting rid of single-family homes. It's always going to be a big market for single-family homes. It's about legalizing other forms of housing and having that mix. And sometimes it gets portrayed as if you allow density in a single-family neighborhood, that means I'm going to have a 30-floor apartment building next to my house. And we're not talking about eliminating all height limits. Some people would like that. I don't. That's not what I'm advocating. You can have a reasonable height limit that preserves quote-unquote community character in terms of the look and feel, but it has 3 or 4 or 6 or 10 units in it instead of just one. So that's, I think, what we're talking about. So
I'm going to come back to try to defend single family if I can in a moment, but I want to ask Maya a question first. To my knowledge, a bunch of YIMBY organizations sprung up in recent years across the state, across the country. In fact, to my knowledge, most are nonpartisan. However, yours is not, and I'm wondering why, especially in a region here is much more conservative than a lot of the others in California.
Well, that's exactly why. So the YIMBY group that I co-founded in 2018, early 2018, it's called the YIMBY Democrats of San Diego County. We have a booth outside if anyone wants to join. We started a Democratic club. We are the first Democratic club that is a YIMBY identified club. The reason why we did that is exactly because San Diego is more of a conservative purple town or county. And while the trend is definitely shifting towards becoming more democratic, we see it in this election cycle for 2020 in the city of San Diego. It's important that we look at the candidates based on how they're responding to the most pressing issues. And in San Diego, I'd say that is absolutely housing and homelessness. And we need to make sure that while we're electing more progressive people, which is what I support, they need to support more housing. And so the function of, well, first of all, YIMBY, in case anyone is not familiar, YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. The concept behind this movement is that our elected officials need to hear from us that we support them making the tough decisions. They usually, at a public hearing, will get dozens of people showing up speaking against new housing, whether it's affordable, permanent supportive housing for homeless people, or market rate housing. And they get so many people coming out against it. Very few people coming out in support who are not the developers themselves. And so the idea with being a YIMBY is that people who really care about the future, about having housing for their children or grandchildren, our decision makers need to hear from us and need to know that they have constituents who support them doing the right thing. And so the next obvious step to me, besides showing up to a hearing, is starting a Democratic club where we can officially endorse candidates and encourage them to do the right thing, encourage them to develop their positions and their campaign based on being pro-housing, pro-building enough housing for our future. And then we support them, we walk and donate to these candidates, and of course hold them accountable if need be. So I think our club has done a really great job of making being a YIMBY a popular idea amongst Democrats, and we're going to keep pushing so that we make sure that our Democratic candidates and electeds are YIMBYs and support the movement.
So I'm going to come back one more time to the single family thing, and then I'm going to let it go. And the reason why I'm doing it is one because we talked about the large percentage of the region that actually is dominated by single-family residential, and also the fact that everyone here seems to get rid of that. And so, when I talk to folks who are living in those communities who are defenders of it, they often express concerns about a lack of infrastructure to handle growth, not enough parking, references to community or neighborhood character. And so, to reframe the question or the issue this way, what objections to growth do you think are legitimate and what aren't? And this is for everyone.
Well, first of all, one thing I do want to just note, so this year, around SB 50 and its predecessor, SB 827, there was this narrative that, oh my God, this is a super unpopular bill. Everyone hates this bill. I have some colleagues in the legislature would say, everyone in my district hates this bill. And I would say, I think that's not the case. People are self-selecting in terms of who's showing up at town halls, emailing, going to city council meetings, and yelling and carrying on. And all of a sudden, we had a poll in San Francisco because in our mayor's race, only one candidate came out in favor of SB 827, and she won. And shortly before the election, there was a poll, and they polled, the idea of this bill, and it polled at 75%. This year, there have been 3 statewide polls on SB 50, asked all in somewhat different ways, but all pretty blunt in terms of what the bill does. And they polled between 61 and 66%, polling majority vote in every single region of the state, every demographic, higher among communities of color, but still high among white people, higher among young people, but still majority support among people over 50, and majority support among homeowners. So I think most people get it. In terms of limits on growth, what I would say is, and people sometimes say, well, California's full, or San Diego's full, or San Francisco's full. There's a lot of people who have pronounced that we're full, or my neighborhood is full. And so, the government should somehow acknowledge that. And I think as government, and for me, just as an elected official or just as a human being, it's none of my business where people want to move. And it's none of government's business where people want to move. People want to move somewhere. They have a right to move there. And that's what California's always been about. And so the idea that we would say, oh, the growth is too much, we have to stop it. Well, we've tried that. We went 50 years where we made it impossible to build enough housing, and our housing production collapsed. You saw those numbers. And guess what happened over that period? Our population went up by a lot. People come anyway, and it just causes all sorts of problems that we haven't built the housing. So yes, the limits on growth, in my mind, we should not be building in the highest wildfire risk areas. We should not be focusing on sprawl and destroying farmland and clogging up the freeways. We should be focusing the growth, and that means rezoning, including rezoning single-family neighborhoods.
And I'll add to that, but I think it's important to make clear that actually in San Diego, at least, and you can confirm this, that most of our population growth into the future is just from San Diegans having children. It's not necessarily people moving here in search of a job. Certainly there's tons of those, but it's just us as a growing region. And so who are these new homes for? It's just for us and for our children. And I hear from plenty of parents that they don't want their kids living in their house until they're in their 30s, right? And I would agree with everything that Senator Weiner just said about where we do not want housing. As a YIMBY, I say yes, but I say yes to making sure that we're building in exactly the right places. That's, of course, near transit in our urban areas, and that's especially near jobs, so that we can reduce those vehicle miles traveled and hopefully get more people riding transit where that's available. But another reason why we started the YIMBY Democrats as a Democratic club is because there's a history of segregation that's real, that's racial and class segregation that has happened across this country and in San Diego. And that happens through zoning. And there's a history of redlining. There's some great literature out there about it that I won't try to explain in depth. But we need to be adding more housing in these exclusionary single-family neighborhoods, especially the ones that have great access to public resources, such as the good school districts, such as the beaches, such as parks. And that's another reason why it is so crucial to be adding more housing, even in single-family zoned neighborhoods, and make sure that we have enough zoned capacity for that type of housing there and not in the backcountry, not in the fire zones.
And I would like to just build on what Maya said and get back to my roots as a former executive director of a nonprofit that advocated for better public transit. I think that access to resources and access to jobs, but around the transportation discussion, we're full on ready to make that shift in the sort of paradigm of how we build, but we haven't quite fulfilled an achievement to make that shift on the transportation side. We're definitely at the verge of it. We've got great folks here from Sandag and Hassan with his 5 big moves, which are starting that shift, and that's pretty amazing. But when I hear the senator talk about high capacity transit running at, my definition, I thought it used to be 10 minutes, but you said 12-minute running times for buses and 7 days a week. I remember evaluating projects to say what would be a great project to go in next to transit. We're like, oh, this one's perfect. Oh, but the transit only runs Monday through Friday, so on Saturdays and Sundays. So we're going to be depending a lot on that, and City of San Diego has already made a huge shift by reducing the required parking for new development in transit areas. But we need to continue to build on the access to transportation alternatives in order to really fulfill that gap. And that will continue to be a point of contention from folks who are NIMBY or don't want to see the additional growth, because the streets will fill up with cars if we are not providing access to alternatives and everyone continues to drive.
Yeah, Lynn, if I could just, you mentioned also the infrastructure issue,
Yeah.
which is a really important one. I think the reliance on we don't have enough infrastructure as an argument against new housing is one of the greatest red herring arguments in politics, and certainly in housing politics. Yes, absolutely. You don't want to just build housing. You want to make sure that your transit and your schools and your libraries and your sewer system and your water system, that everything is keeping up. Absolutely. You can't just look at it as one. These are all integrated issues, and I'm a huge supporter of infrastructure investment increases. And California, like the rest of the country, has sort of fallen down on that, although we're starting to turn it around. But the notion that you can't build housing until you have to perfect all of the infrastructure into this beautiful, perfect, heavenly thing, and then you can plop the housing down in the middle of it. That's just not how the real world works. And with the exception of those hyper-planned communities where you build everything from scratch, putting that aside, because that's the exception, when you look at how cities and towns all over the state and country form, it's not do the infrastructure first and then we'll put the housing there. It's a little bit of you play catch up, the housing gets ahead, this falls behind, more people move there, they build housing, then there's demand for more infrastructure, so you do the infrastructure. It's not perfect. I would love for the infrastructure to be perfected as the housing is built, but it's just not as neat as that. And that's not the history of human existence is you have to play catch up sometimes, and populations shift around. So yes, we must prioritize modernizing and improving our infrastructure, not just our publicly owned, also that disaster known as PG&E. We have to, it's private companies too that have critical infrastructure. So we just have to do better, but it can't inhibit housing. And the reality is, even without the infrastructure, people still move in the communities and go send their kids to school and use the water and use the streets. But it might be that they are living 3 families to a unit, or it might be that they're living in their car, or it might be that they're paying 70% of their income for housing and so effectively living in poverty. So they're already using the infrastructure, so let's just have enough housing.
So you may recall the slide that is part of the presentation that talked about how at an aggregate level, the academic research suggests that more housing supply is good to limit or perhaps even in some cases lower housing costs, but that research is less clear and specific in individual neighborhoods. So how do you take into account communities at risk of gentrification and displacement when you're talking about proposals to add supply? That's for anybody.
Housing preservation of existing affordable units has continued to be a major issue within the city of San Diego. I know our council president, Georgette Gomez, put forth a housing preservation strategy, and the sort of policy conundrum of that is, what's gonna be the biggest overall benefit for San Diegans? Is it preserve older, perhaps even potentially substandard affordable housing units because they are, or and most of them often sometimes are low density, or do you bring in new units, last longer, higher density? And that's something that the city of San Diego has been wrestling with for a year. There's definitely different strategies that have the potential to protect neighborhoods. We always said that gentrification in itself isn't bad, but the displacement that follows is, and so that is a real issue. And I think that as we look going forward to what's right for San Diegans, we're gonna have to continue little by little providing that balance. And it's, having those policy discussions, realizing it can't be one way or another. It has to be a little bit of each. And as we're making policy decisions, we have to be able to reflect on that. So I just wanted to make sure we touched on that.
I'll just add that I think commonly it's portrayed that there's the YIMBYs and then there's the tenant organizers and the people on the tenant side, and I think that fundamentally is not the right way of looking at it. I think YIMBYs, we want to have it all. We want to protect tenants immediately because we should not allow for people to be displaced. But we long-term need to be working on the solution that requires building enough housing for everyone. Long-term, the only way we're going to fix the housing crisis is if there is abundant housing and we're not being stretched so thin. And so a big part of how YIMBYs are working on this is, again, focusing on increasing the capacity to build housing, especially affordable housing in exclusionary zoned areas, as well as in traditionally more wealthy neighborhoods, even if they are multifamily, like Bankers Hill, and supporting housing projects that include affordable on-site, and that ultimately will be able to desegregate communities and make San Diego more affordable long-term by building more housing and protecting renters.
Excuse me. Yeah, I completely agree with that. In terms of the YIMBY movement, I think early on there were some voices in the YIMBY movement that had a very libertarian bent, and it was just about supply, supply, supply. And I think that has quickly changed. And the YIMBYs I know, and I know many YIMBYs in San Francisco and statewide, are some of the most lefty people I know. On my Senate campaign in 2016, I think I was just about the only Hillary Clinton supporter on my campaign team. I have very super YIMBY field organizers, and they were all strong Bernie people. And now they're either Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. So these are really progressive people who do not want to see people getting evicted and do not want to see low-income and working-class people being pushed out. It is absolutely the case that for the long run, to structurally fix the problem, we have to have a huge increase in supply. And ultimately, the shortage of housing is the top driver of displacement. When you have a shortage and scarcity and prices explode, and there's an incentive for landlords to push people out. But for the immediate problem, we have to have strong anti-displacement measures. We have to protect renters. And we just passed, and I apologize for my voice, but we just passed AB 1482 this year, a renter protection bill, which would be unimaginable 3 or 4 years ago to pass in the legislature. It would have died in its first committee. But it places a statewide rent cap, 5% plus CPI, statewide, without overriding more protective local ordinances, and statewide just cause. And it's, again, it still blows my mind that it actually passed, and I was a co-author of it. I was happy to support it. It's incredible that it passed. So we have to be keeping people in the housing that they have. When you look at those spikes in homelessness, it's not because all of a sudden more people are mentally ill now than there were 2 years ago, or there's more addiction now than there was 2 years ago. Yes, mental health and addiction are factors in homelessness. That spike is because people are getting evicted from their apartments, getting pushed out, and they have nowhere to go, and they don't want to move to Denver. They want to stay in their community, and so now they're couch surfing or living in a car or living in a shelter. So we have to make sure that we are not allowing mass demolition of rental housing in particular, and that when there is displacement, that it is temporary displacement, so you have a rate of return, which we've seen in some projects in San Francisco. If you take a small building and you want to turn it into a much bigger one, and those tenants are taken care of or put somewhere else temporarily, not paying more rent, and then have a right to return at the same rent. So there are different tools that we can use, but it has to be part of the conversation.
I want to push this a little bit more on this question and frame it this way. Oftentimes when people see cranes in the sky in their neighborhood, or in other neighborhoods around the city or the region they're in, they see housing coming that they believe isn't for them, meaning it's too expensive for them to live in. Are they wrong? And what do you do about that?
This is why housing politics is so hard. So when you spend 50 years systematically not building enough housing and designing rules to make it harder and harder to build housing, and so you accumulate a multi-million home deficit, you can't fix that overnight. I wish that there were a way, say, we're going to do this, and within 3 years, California, we're going to solve our affordability problem. If any politician that tells you that has a bridge to sell you to. It's going to take a long time, and what that means is, okay, you have a huge deficit, so we're going to build our first 100,000 homes. Well, you build those first homes, it's not like that's going to collapse the cost of housing. They're going to be expensive because you have scarcity. And that is hard because people say, okay, you're building this housing and it's really expensive. It's not for me. It's luxury housing. Everything that's not subsidized gets branded as luxury housing because it's expensive. Well, guess what? The 50-year-old apartments are also super expensive. The 100-year-old apartments are also everything is expensive, not because it's luxury, but because there's not enough of it. And so that makes the politics really, really hard. People say, God, you're building, I see the cranes, they took parking spaces away because of the construction, it's really annoying, and it's still expensive, so you must be lying when you say it's going to make it more affordable. And you say, well, just be patient. There will be some short-term benefits, but give it 10 or 15 years, it's going to be great, and it's going to be great for your kids. That, as a politician who will be termed out by the time this gets resolved, it's hard. But it is one of those, it's a political situation where you have to inspire people to think long-term. To say, we're going to take short-term steps to triage, to make sure people aren't getting pushed out, to make sure that people are stable. We're going to do that. We're going to move as fast as we can to build supportive housing for the homeless and so forth. But we have to stay the course for a long period of time. And I think it's also, one last thing it's important to understand, people sometimes have a perception, wow, we're going so gangbuster on housing. And it's true, there have been a lot of great work done locally in San Francisco and San Diego and LA, rezoning. But if you look at actual housing production in California, it's actually been going down. We should be at 180 or so thousand units a year. In 2016, and Liam will correct me if I'm wrong, in 2016 we built about 85,000 units of housing. In 2017 it went down to 80,000. And last year it was 77,000.
I'm not sure if that's net, but by the permit number, it's a little bit over 100.
Right, but in terms of what was actually built, it was 77,000 units of housing last year.
Maybe a net, but I don't want to.
Yeah, and it's been But regardless, where it's not like all of a sudden we've been exploding our housing production. And it's not just because of zoning or NIMBYism. We have major issues with construction costs. We have a major construction worker shortage that's been exacerbated by this president's immigration policies. The cost of goods the cost of materials has gone up. The tariffs have made it worse. We have a lot of cost issues as well.
You see a lot of the cranes down in San Diego, downtown San Diego, building residential right now, but those residential units are not affordable to the people who work in downtown San Diego. So, for instance, I work downtown, I'm not going to be able to afford a $2 million unit, even though I'd love to be able to do that. So part of the problem is the type of units that are being built too, but a lot of that has to do with the cost of construction. From the developer's perspective, that's about where they need to build in order to be able to make some type of a profit. So being able to actually build affordable housing really is, it's a big problem in this region right now.
And just to be explicit, we need to be increasing funding for affordable housing like now, like many years ago. We need to be building subsidized affordable housing, because even if we had all the housing built, then we never had a lag in the last 30, 50 years. There will always be people who need to have subsidized housing. So I don't think any of us, at least on the left, are arguing that this is purely like a capitalist solution. We need to have affordable subsidized housing, but there's a lot of us who would not qualify even if there was enough affordable housing for everyone. So that's why we also need to be building the market rate housing for the rest of us.
I just have a quick data point to build on, just sort of something that I've been thinking about recently as I look at the permitting numbers for the city of San Diego and the 4,000 units that were constructed in San Diego last year. Development Services Department is booming. My staff works nonstop. What are they working on? Well, they're working on some residential new development, but a whole host of existing residential remodels and additions. And if it's not an accessory dwelling unit or a granny flat and they're just adding on an extra bedroom but not permitting it as a junior unit, we're not actually counting that towards any additional housing, but those are real people moving into those bedrooms. And so that's something that I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper into, because we really are doing a ton of that work, none of which is being reported to the state or captured for additional housing opportunities.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we'll have time maybe for a couple audience questions, but I want to, if someone can help me with passing this mic around. But I want to be very clear, audience questions, not audience comments. And if people have a comment, not a question, please don't. I will be mean to you. Here is my question for everybody. So what does a San Diego or a California that has the kind of housing production you'd like to see look like? Yeah, as the housing supply increase that you would like to see, what does a San Diego look like? What does a California look like that has the sort of housing abundance that you would like to see?
I think we have to talk about, when we say what a community or a state looks like, and this ties into the conversations about neighborhood character. It's so important, I think, always to keep in mind the neighborhood character. We tend to think of it as it's about the physicality of the neighborhood, what's the design, the heights, what does it look like when you look around, and that's important, don't get me wrong. But it's also about the people who live there. And so when we protect quote unquote neighborhood character by saying we don't want anything to look different, that you might be very successful in doing that, and we have been in many communities, but people get pushed out, just priced out, and you end up having less diversity of all types in that community, and your character has changed. So California of the future, I don't think it has to be the land of mega high-rises everywhere. I think you can have modest increases in density that aren't even that dramatic, but just more flexibility in allowing different kinds of housing, and you can add a huge amount of new housing that way. So not having profound changes for what a community looks like, but more modest changes. And if you do that all over, it can have a big impact. And what that will mean is, in terms of what California looks like, we will continue to look like what we've always been, which is a state where people can move here and make lives for themselves, whether it's from out of the country and immigrate here or from other parts of the United States. We'll continue to be a place where we foster innovation and creativity and have artists, and where teachers can live in the communities where they teach, and where young people can move back to the town where they grew up. So I think in that aspect too, we will hopefully look like what California has always prided ourselves in terms of what we're about.
For me, what it looks like is creating housing for the population of the future, and we need to really consider that. Of the 700,000 new people that will be here in San Diego, about 500,000 of those will be age 65 plus. So we're going to be living longer, and the population is aging too. So the type of housing that you need for people who are 65, 75, 85, 95 years old and still active in the future is really something that we need to look at. And at Sandag, one of the things that we're doing with the 5 big moves is to really look at these mobility hubs that would be all throughout the entire region, where you would have higher density housing and jobs co-located around a transportation hub. And these type of more forward-looking concepts are really what need to be built. We need to build 15 to 20,000 units a year for the next foreseeable future in order to overcome the deficit that we have right now. So really rethinking land use and being able to figure out how are we going to meet the state mandated goals and how are we going to create quality of life within the region, I think is really important. And one way to do it is to densify around mobility hubs.
I think that you're going to see a lot of innovation in how people live. We are already starting to have projects come forward and finding out about projects where we don't have those things in our code yet. We're not exactly sure. Like, for example, like co-living or cooperative living, you're gonna see a lot more people who share one kitchen but have their own space and have communal space. I think we're gonna see a lot more of that. You're gonna see a lot of smaller units, micro units, where people live, people without kids perhaps are living in more studio environments, a lot more so than currently in San Diego. You're gonna see a lot of different construction and materials types. You are going to see houses made out of things you probably didn't think houses could be made out of. And so the look and feel of what all of that looks like is going to change dramatically. I can tell you we're also going to be seeing a lot more people doing things like instead of just sharing scooters, it's going to be, the next thing is going to be shared mopeds. I'm telling you, bank on it right now. Shared mopeds are going to be everywhere. So there's really going to be a lot of innovation, and I think that where we get back to that single family challenge is you will see people coming out like in full force saying we're not ready to accept this change, but you're going to have politicians who say we have to innovate, we have to start the change now, we can't do things the way that we did the last 50 years.
And I'll just add that when there is ultimately enough housing and it's affordable at all income levels, and we have subsidized housing as well as market rate housing, or who knows, even public housing, for that to happen, it will also have to happen side by side with alleviating poverty and making sure that people have a living wage and are able to take care of themselves. We need to find a place for our homeless neighbors to live, and I think it just goes alongside with having people get out of poverty and into middle-class lifestyles.
So we're actually running really low on time, so I am going to allow 2 questions, but please let's make them questions and directed to 1 or 2 folks. Sir, go ahead.
Okay. The cost of housing has been brought up as one of the impediments to creating affordable. Has anyone ever looked at it? And I used to build affordable and finance affordable for many years. Has everyone ever looked at the codes and ways that we could build housing, revise the building codes to allow cheaper materials, staying within health and safety, but to a way of building housing cheaper? It seems like we never look at that side of the equation.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a focus, and we see it with the trend towards exploring modular housing or cross-laminated timber instead of steel, and it's all very controversial at times. But I think also, and this is a really hard one, I say this as an ardent environmentalist and someone who has participated in this effort, we want our buildings to be as green as possible. And so there's Title 24 of the state building code that has all sorts of requirements to make buildings as green as possible and moving towards now carbon neutrality. And that's all great. And I've been supportive of that, and I have participated in that effort. But in the aggregate, when we talk about costs and housing, there is an open question. If you're building an apartment building right on top of a BART station, if I could be Bay Area centric for the moment, should you maybe get a little relief from that? Because what you're doing is inherently so profoundly, anti-climate change. That's super controversial, but I think it's something we have to at least talk about, because that does add significant costs, although there are significant benefits of having greener buildings.
Sir, here.
Okay. Hi there. So, name's Frank. I am here to ask you a question. So, if we're going to talk about the new housing crisis and, basically about the future on how we're going to place all these new homes and all these new zonings, so what's also going to be the fate, of course, of the different schools? Like, how are we going to make sure that all the schools, are basically going to be treated fairly, and how are we going to make sure that there is no, imbalance? Like, we can't have communities, where the schools are basically like, how do I put this? Oh, we can't have low-income schools versus high-budget schools. So the point is, how are we going to make sure that all of this is going to be fair and distributed equally?
Well, I think that's a big part of the movement that we're doing here with the UMB Democrats, is that we need to be, once again, desegregating our neighborhoods so that people of all income levels can live and attend high-quality schools, and bring schools that are in other neighborhoods up to the same standard. There's neighborhoods now that are closing down their elementary schools because families are leaving, because families can't afford to live in those neighborhoods anymore. We're literally closing schools. So I think the whole idea is to elevate everyone's quality of life and living by making housing more affordable at all income levels, by building enough housing, over time making it more affordable, having a healthy ecosystem of housing where over time, when we have enough housing that's been built over every single year at a steady pace, that we can all afford to live in the neighborhoods we choose, near good schools, near our jobs.
Okay, hopefully folks can stay after a little bit. If folks in the audience have questions, there is some more time, but they were running low now, so thank you very much to all our panelists.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Voice of San Diego podcast. Make sure you keep an eye on your podcast feed this week. We'll be posting more panels from Politifest. And don't forget to join us for our weekly roundup of local news every Friday afternoon on the Voice of San Diego podcast.